Who was Africa before colonization? Have you ever noticed that when Africa is discussed, history often seems to begin with colonization? It is almost as if everything before the arrival of Europeans has been reduced to a footnote. We are told about the scramble for Africa, the partitioning of the continent, the struggle for independence, and the challenges that followed. These are undoubtedly important chapters, but they are not the beginning of Africa's story. Today, I want us to ask a question that I believe every African, and indeed every student of history, should ask. Who was Africa before colonization? Not because we wish to romanticize the past, not because we are searching for a golden age, but because understanding where we came from shapes how we understand who we are today. One of the greatest tragedies of history is not simply the loss of land or wealth, it is the loss of memory. When a people forget their story, they often begin to see themselves through the eyes of others. That is why this conversation matters. Africa did not begin in 1884 at the Berlin Conference. Africa did not suddenly become a continent when European powers drew borders on maps. Long before those events, Africa was home to diverse societies, languages, cultures, and political systems. It was never one nation, one kingdom, or one civilization. It was, and still is, a continent of extraordinary diversity. This diversity is important because it protects us from replacing one oversimplification with another. Just as it would be misleading to describe all of Europe with a single story, it would be equally misleading to describe all of Africa as though every community lived the same way. Yet, despite this diversity, many African societies shared common principles. Communities valued relationships over individualism. Land was often viewed as an inheritance held in trust rather than simply a commodity to be bought and sold. Leadership was frequently understood as stewardship. A chief, king, or queen was expected to protect the people, preserve justice, and maintain harmony within the community. Leadership was not perfect, but it was generally understood to carry responsibility before privilege. Knowledge was another pillar of African civilization. Many people assume that because much of Africa relied on oral tradition, knowledge was somehow unreliable. That assumption reveals more about modern prejudice than historical reality. Oral tradition was disciplined, histories were memorized, genealogies were preserved, moral teachings were passed from generation to generation with remarkable accuracy. Professional storytellers, historians, and custodians of memory existed in many societies because preserving knowledge was considered essential to preserving civilization itself. Think about that for a moment. Today, many of us cannot remember the names of our great-grandparents. Yet, entire family histories were once preserved without written records because communities understood that memory was identity. Trade also flourished across the continent. African merchants exchanged gold, salt, iron, textiles, ivory, and countless other goods through networks that stretched across deserts, rivers, and oceans. Commerce connected West Africa with North Africa. East Africa traded across the Indian Ocean. Southern Africa developed its own regional trade systems. These exchanges were not signs of isolation. They demonstrate that African societies were deeply connected to wider economic worlds. Education also looked different from the classroom model familiar today. Children learned through participation. Skills were taught by observation, repetition, and mentorship. Farming, craftsmanship, leadership, conflict resolution, and spiritual responsibilities were learned within families and communities. Education prepared people not only to earn a living, but to fulfill responsibilities within society. Of course, pre-colonial Africa was not perfect. There were wars, there were rivalries, there were injustices. Some societies practiced slavery, others experienced political instability. Acknowledging these realities is not an attack on Africa. It is simply an honest recognition that every civilization contains both achievements and failures. History loses its value when it becomes propaganda. Our responsibility is not to create heroes without flaws or villains without humanity. Our responsibility is to pursue truth. Why does all this matter today? Because history influences identity. If generations are taught that their ancestors contributed nothing to civilization, what effect might that have on their confidence? If children grow up believing that wisdom always comes from somewhere else, how likely are they to value the knowledge within their own communities? Confidence is not built through empty slogans. It grows when people understand both the strengths and weaknesses of their own history. One of the lasting consequences of colonial education was that many Africans became more familiar with European history than African history. Many could identify foreign monarchs, yet knew little about the leaders, thinkers, and societies that shaped the regions where their own families lived. This is not about rejecting European history. It is about restoring balance. Understanding African history does not require hostility towards other cultures. In fact, genuine historical understanding encourages humility because we begin to see that every civilization has learned from others. The goal is not superiority. The goal is self-understanding. When people know who they are, they become less dependent on borrowed identities. They become more capable of engaging confidently with the wider world. This is why I often say that Africa does not simply face economic challenges, it also faces challenges of memory. Development is not measured only by roads, buildings, or technology. Development also depends upon confidence, responsibility, and cultural continuity. A society that remembers its story is often better equipped to shape its future. That does not mean returning to the past. History cannot be repeated, nor should it be. The world has changed. Technology has changed. Economies have changed. The question is not whether Africa should recreate the 15th century. The question is whether Africa can enter the 21st century without forgetting the foundations upon which previous generations built their communities. Imagine constructing a house while ignoring its foundations. Eventually, cracks appear. The same principle applies to societies. When identity becomes disconnected from history, confusion often follows. People search everywhere for meaning because they no longer recognize the values that once guided them. This is why conversations about African identity are not merely academic. They are practical. Identity shapes choices. Choices shape institutions. Institutions shape nations. So, who was Africa before colonization? Africa was a continent of builders, of traders, of farmers, of craftsmen, of scholars, of spiritual traditions, of families, of kingdoms, of communities seeking order, justice, and meaning in ways that reflected their own environments and histories. Were those societies flawless? Certainly not. Neither was Rome, neither was China, neither was Britain, neither is any nation today. The standard should never be perfection. The standard should be honesty. As we study African history, we must resist two temptations. The first is to dismiss Africa's past as insignificant. The second is to romanticize it as perfect. Both positions prevent us from learning. Real maturity lies between those extremes. It celebrates genuine achievements. It confronts uncomfortable truths. It asks difficult questions. And it remains open to evidence wherever that evidence leads. Perhaps that is the greatest act of remembering, not preserving comforting myths, but recovering an honest understanding of who we were so that we can become wiser about who we choose to be. The future of Africa will not be secured simply by importing solutions from elsewhere. Neither will it be secured by living nostalgically in the past. It will be built by people who understand their history, accept responsibility for the present, and work faithfully towards a better future. That journey begins with remembering. Not remembering everything, not pretending every answer lies behind us, but remembering enough to know that Africa's story did not begin with colonization, and it certainly does not end with it. If this conversation has encouraged you to think more deeply about African identity, history, and civilization, I invite you to continue exploring these ideas in my book, Broken Ancestry. Until next time, keep asking thoughtful questions, keep seeking truth, and above all, keep remembering.